Hello, my name is Christopher Wells, and I am the Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at the Personalized Medicine Coalition. On behalf of the coalition, I want to welcome everyone to this virtual tutorial titled Regulatory Pathways for Diagnostic Tests in the United States and Europe, which the coalition is co-hosting with its partners at the European Infrastructure for Translational Medicine and at Codex for SMEs, which stands for Companion Diagnostics Expedited for Small and Medium-Sized Businesses. For those of you who are not familiar, PMC is a nonprofit education and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., whose goal is to promote the understanding and adoption of concepts, services, and products that will advance the frontiers of personalized medicine. The coalition's programmatic portfolio includes advocacy initiatives undertaken in collaboration with a congressional personalized medicine caucus, research programs focused on facilitating evidence generation and the clinical uptake of personalized medicine, and educational initiatives, including the coalition's flagship annual Personalized Medicine Conference, which will take place this year in Dana Point, California on November 30 and December 1. So for the 18% of PMC members whose operations are based outside of the United States, the coalition's activities also include educational programs designed to provide baseline knowledge about the regulatory pathways available to those who are developing innovative tests and treatments for the United States market. The goal here is to help facilitate the efficient regulatory review of a new generation of personalized medicine products that we believe will deliver important benefits to both patients and health systems. Today's tutorial on regulatory pathways for diagnostic tests is part of this larger effort. And the tutorial will explore pathways in the United States with reference also to the European landscape. Those who may be interested in more information about PMC membership or about the annual Personalized Medicine Conference can email me using the contact details that will be provided at the end of this presentation. So before we get started with the content of today's discussion, I am going to turn it over to our partners to say a few words of introduction, beginning with a video submitted by Antonio Andrew, who serves as a PMC board member and as the scientific director of the European Infrastructure for Translational Medicine.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tony Andreu. I'm the scientific director of EATRIS, the European Infrastructure for Translational Medicine. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this virtual tutorial on regulatory pathways for diagnostic tests in the United States and Europe, co-organized by the Personalized Medicine Coalition, Codex for SME, and EATRIS. In the last few years, we've seen an enormous explosion of the tools that give us the possibility of being much more precise in the way we deliver healthcare, adopting, therefore, the personalized medicine paradigm, giving to the right patient the right drug at the right time at the right dose. This capacity that we have for being much more precise in the way we stratify patients along the entire healthcare value chain, from prevention, diagnostic, and therapy, give us, as I say, the opportunity of delivering a better healthcare. But it has also challenges, and it has also bottlenecks in this process. Maybe one of the most significant ones is the regulatory journey for these tools to make sure that they reach the patient community as soon as possible. And here, the experience of the US and Europe is slightly different. There are similarities, but there are also differences in our regulatory culture and regulatory processes. And this virtual tutorial gives us the opportunity of sharing our experience and exchanging ideas and understanding a little bit how we operate on both sides of the Atlantic for the development of this regulatory journey. I think that more than ever, the United States and Europe are united in a joint enterprise to advance the frontiers of personalized medicine for the benefit of patients and also for improving the way we provide health care. So I encourage you to enjoy this virtual tutorial and extract from it not only the precise characteristics of the regulatory journey, but also the awareness that we are a single community where there are no borders, and we have the opportunity of all together developing the best tools for making personalized medicine the way medicine will be delivered during the 21st century. Thank you very much and enjoy the meeting.
Okay, now by way of a final introduction, I want to turn it over to Margot Yile, who is project leader at Codex for SMEs, and she's going to say a few words about the Codex for SMEs program. So, Margot, take it away.
Thanks a lot. I'm very pleased having the opportunity to present very briefly the Codex for SMEs project and what it is about, that you have some backgrounds. I'm also very pleased that we had the opportunity to cooperate with PMC and EATRIS. So I'm very pleased to say some words about the project. As already mentioned, it's an Interreg Northwest Europe project. It's already running for a long time. It started in 2017 and it will be finalized in the end of this year. And the real objective of the project has been to support SMEs along the whole value chain of companion or diagnostics development. And it was the aim to establish a huge network. You see on this slide an overview about the partners. The partners have been in total 9. Mainly cluster organizations in the field of life sciences, as well as higher research organizations like EATRIS or IBBL. I just want to go or to mention briefly the heart of the project. We provided within the framework of this project a so-called fast-track program, which means we provide tailored services, especially for SMEs. And those services has been available between February 2022 and 2023 September. And SMEs had the opportunity to apply for those kind of services, which have been free of charge for them. We also established an online map where organizations, stakeholders in this field had the opportunity to upload their profile, become a little bit visible. We also established a networking platform, which is still open and accessible. In the meantime, we have almost 400 participants already registered to this networking platform. The platform will be available until September 13th. And we would be really very pleased to get more participants to this platform and increase the Codex for SMEs or the diagnostic network and really become a huge network, and also joining companies and organizations from the United States. That would be very fine for us. In the next slide, I don't want to go into detail. That is just that you see what we have been offered within the framework of the project. It's also all the services which have been free of charge for the SMEs. In case you have some questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. I can provide more details. I would like to highlight in the end that we are going to publish a final brochure about our project, and this brochure will provide facts and success numbers of this project. We have been really available and able to establish a huge network in the meantime, which is spread over whole Europe, and already some companies and stakeholders from the United States are also becoming part of that, and therefore we would be very pleased to increase this network. And therefore I'm very interested to get more insights today during the presentations and give the floor back to Chris. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Margot. So now we will begin the programmatic portion of today's discussion. Without further ado, the discussion today will be led by Joseph Ferrara, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for Veranex, and Sheila Wolkoff, who is CEO of Goldbug Strategies. Joining Joseph and Sheila is Sylvia Angel, who serves as an Associate Director and Head of In Vitro Diagnostics for Veranex in Europe. And so during and after the presentation, you will have the opportunity to submit questions to the presenters through the chat function that is provided at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation is complete, we will answer as many of your questions as possible before we conclude this webinar. So with my thanks to each of the presenters, I will now turn it over to Joseph, Sheila, and Sylvia to go ahead and take it away. And we look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Ferrara, and Chief Strategy Officer of Veranex. I'd like to thank the PMC, EATRIS, and Interreg for hosting today's tutorial, and also to thank my colleagues, Sylvia Angel from Veranex and Sheila Walkoff from Goldbug Strategies. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll begin the presentation. I'm going to walk through briefly what we'll cover, and in the spirit of a tutorial, of course, we'll be looking at fundamentals. This includes starting with the US and the regulation of clinical lab tests in the US, key agencies, who are the stakeholders, the pathways, as the title of our talk suggests, and then some key US market entry considerations, as well as case studies. We'll then shift gears, and Sylvia will discuss regulation of clinical lab tests in the EU, so you'll get a comparative view, including companion diagnostics, and then some insights on testing and clinical trials. We'll wrap up with a summary and Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Sheila Walkoff from Goldbug Strategies to take us through the fundamentals regulation of clinical lab tests in the US.
Thank you, Joe. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning, and I appreciate our PMC and our co-sponsors putting this webinar together. I know we have a variety of folks attending today and a variety of levels of expertise in this, but as Joe said, we're starting with fundamentals, and hopefully, you all have some questions when we get to the more meaty stuff in a couple of slides. So just to start out in the United States, some of the key regulatory bodies, I think everyone knows the FDA. And here we're going to lay out just the role and the authorities under which they operate. So the FDA develops and implements all of the federal regulations and guidelines related to IVD tests and medical devices. IVDs are a subset of medical devices. And the authority is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic DAC, and you see that abbreviated everywhere, FD&C Act. The standards are something we're going to talk about today because they differ among in vitro diagnostic devices and laboratory tests, and there are differences in terms of what other regulatory bodies look for example, for reimbursement and for advertising and promotion. So the FDA is charged with determining that in vitro diagnostics are safe and effective for their claimed intended use. CMS, on the other hand, which I think most people are familiar with because of the reimbursement role that they do play, that primarily in our world, they regulate labs and that perform testing on human specimens and those that report out patient-specific results. And that's really the key in terms of being a CLIA laboratory. If you're going to report patient-specific results to anyone in a clinical trial situation or in any other context, it doesn't matter if you're getting paid, doesn't matter if the patient is unaware of the results, you must operate in a CLIA lab. And then as we noted, they also establish the payment and coverage policies for the Medicare and Medicaid programs. In that, we have a difference of standard. When they're doing the reimbursement, CMS looks for the sponsor to establish that the test is reasonable and necessary for clinical care, and that doesn't always align with safe and effective for intended use. Next slide, Joe. In addition to CLIA and CMS and FDA, there are also state agencies. They implement CLIA in each individual states. There are a couple states that are exempt. Many people are familiar with New York, State Department of Health, and their CLEP program. So in addition to the federal regulations, laboratories must comply with state regulations as well. And so if you are distributing an IVD device to a laboratory to perform, that's where the state agencies primarily come into play. there's another agency, the Federal Trade Commission, that's often forgotten about until you get a letter that no one likes to receive except potentially your outside counsel, because they're going to make more money on it. But FTC is charged with monitoring for deceptive advertising practices and protecting consumers. And so they also have a standard that whatever you say about your test must be truthful and not misleading. And FTC in recent years really hasn't been shy about coming after companies that that they believe are going beyond what the scientific discourse at the time enables them to say. So again, third-party accreditors, I think most people are familiar with CAP, also Joint Commission, and those are entities that do the inspections of laboratories, and you can also get the third-party accreditation. So next slide. In the United States, there are two fundamental pathways for commercializing a clinical diagnostic. And there's been a lot of debate about this over the last decade and a half. The first is as a laboratory developed test. That's one that's designed, developed, and furnished by a single clinical laboratory. There really is no statutory or regulatory definition for an LDT. I find it to be a much more satisfying term than home brew, but essentially it's an in-house lab test. And FDA has established a PRO code, a product code, defining that really for the purposes of their enforcement discretion. What they will and will not determine at this point in time is a medical device that requires FDA oversight. So the setting is a high complexity clinical lab, and the indications aren't restricted by FDA, except that, as I said earlier, they must be truthful and not misleading, according to the FTC. And the validation is limited to really establishing the test performance characteristics and specifications under CLIA. So that's a lot more limited validation data than required by FDA, and certainly than by what you'll hear for IVDR later. Quality systems, again, nothing specific is required, but many laboratories get CAP accreditation. Many laboratories go further and get ISO 13485. But there's no design control per se required for clinical laboratory tests. Likewise, generally they're under enforcement discretion, which means that FDA can assert their authority over a laboratory developed test, but they choose generally not to, at least at this point in time, except in certain cases, and we'll get to those. So they're not exempt, they're just under enforcement discretion. Second way you can come in is as a distributed kit or an FDA regulated medical device, and those are the terminology slightly different, manufactured and distributed to multiple CLIA labs. Alternatively, you can be a clinical lab test, an LDT that voluntarily goes through FDA, and in which case you're called a single site assay, single site IVD medical device. Anything that's regulated by FDA is going to be limited to the labeling that FDA approves when they do the review and the clearance or approval. So when you are advertising and promoting your test after you receive that clearance, you can't go beyond what's in your label. And there are certain provisions that limit that related to misbranding. FTC also keeps an eye on that. There's a significant difference in the amount of data and what types of data that you need to submit in order to get FDA clearance or approval, and differences in the quality systems. So FDA has quality system regulations, and soon they're going to be accepting also ISO 13485. It's nearly published in final regulatory format. But the products and components of medical devices, including IVDs, also need to be manufactured under those quality systems. And in your submission, you have to have both analytical and clinical validity. So performance data needs to include evidence of design control, all the way from sample collection to the result, that is the entire test system, and includes software, and does not include cost data or clinical utility outcomes type data. That is left to CMS in the determination, or private payers in the determination of reasonable and necessary for clinical care. So next slide. Right, continuing on with the fundamentals in terms of the pathways for FDA devices, FDA IVD devices. everything with respect to FDA is risk-based according to your intended use, which is essentially your claims, what you're saying about the indications for the test. And going from most risky to least risky in the FDA's view, the first is pre-market application. It's always termed a PMA. It's the highest risk, a class 3. And everything, any medical device that isn't already quote classified is by default a class 3 unless it's down classified. So, so if you're in a class 3, if you have a class 3 device, you cannot market it without submitting a PMA and getting that approval from FDA. The next is a de novo, and sometimes people call it a de novo 510K, but really, as I said, by default, under the law, everything is class 3 unless it's down classified, and FDA has in recent years really increasingly used de novo applications. It's a request for down classification, essentially, or request for classification for moderate risk devices with novel intended uses. And so the key there is a risk assessment that demonstrates that test, the risks of that test to human health can be mitigated appropriately using what's called special controls. General controls are things like quality systems and design controls. Special controls include limitations on labeling and other types of limitations on what you can do with your test system. Probably the pathway that people are most familiar with is called the 510K. That's a pre-market notification. And in order to use the 510K pathway, you have to find what's called a predicate device, and you have to make a determination that your test system is substantially equivalent to that predicate device. And substantially equivalent doesn't mean exactly the same. The intended use needs to be the same, but you can have technological differences so long as those do not introduce new risks of safety and effectiveness. And sometimes there's a discussion with the agency about that. If you're not in a class 3 and you're not a class 2, that leaves us with class 1, which are the lowest risk devices. A baseline general control with FDA is registration and listing. It means that you have to register your establishment or your company with the agency and then list the devices that you're selling, the diagnostics that you're selling. And that's one way FDA keeps track of everything out in the marketplace. Most class 1 devices are exempt from the submission requirement. That doesn't necessarily mean they're exempt from those general controls like quality systems and design control. There are some moderate risk class 2 devices that are also exempt from pre-market submission, which is why it's really important to do that research ahead of time so you know the appropriate pathway to take with FDA. And finally, for those that are interested in working with pharma and pharma partners, investigational device exemption is a type of submission that you provide to the FDA when you're working in a clinical trial in certain cases. And we'll get into that a little more in a couple of minutes. So next slide. Regulatory requirements for clinical trial assays, which are CTAs. And there's 2 ways. It's a different type of an evaluation. It's also risk-based, but it's not exactly the same as when you're deciding which regulatory pathway to take for commercializing your assay. So the first decision that needs to be made is the use of your device in this clinical trial a significant risk or non-significant risk? And for the most part, for in vitro diagnostics, the uses are non-significant risk, but there's a guidance that FDA has published, so you can go through that and make that determination. The intended use setting for all investigational use only devices, all clinical trial assays, must be a CLIA certified lab. As I mentioned before, if you're going to be reporting patient-specific results to anyone, including in a clinical trial, you have to be doing it in a CLIA lab. For non-significant risk devices, the report goes out, it's labeled for investigational use only. There's IRB oversight in both of these cases, but in the case of non-significant risk, the IRB acts in the shoes essentially of the investigational device exemption. So you don't need to make that submission if it's a non-significant risk use. And then I said, abbreviated IDE. For significant risk, much the same with the IRB oversight, except you have to make the additional submission to obtain the investigational device exemption in order to conduct that trial. In that submission, you need to demonstrate design control. There's some abbreviated manufacturing requirements. Software is always an important focus in FDA submissions, and the clinical study protocol. In terms of working with pharma, which is a question that comes up to us quite a bit, whether it's coming from pharma to find a partner lab or laboratories that are looking to partner with pharma, one of the biggest hurdles that we find is that clinical laboratories in the US, by and large, aren't really ready to meet many of these FDA requirements that pharma is going to require, because they are a regulated medical device and regulated entity, and they know well FDA's processes. So some of the things the diagnostic partner should be prepared for are more specific turnaround times, determined by the pharma and by your protocols, more validation data that's going to need to meet pharma's requirements for their ultimate submission, and quality management system that's going to show the complete system level information, in particular design control. So there might be questions later on the FDA's new CDX oncology program, and right now unless we have someone from FDA, it's still unclear exactly how the IDE requirements are going to apply to that pilot program. So next slide. A couple of kind of thoughts on different types of products that you will have likely heard of or will be interested in investigating for your diagnostic, and across just some product comparisons. We talked about LDT already, laboratory developed test, which is designed, developed, and performed in a single clinical lab. There's also, as I said, IVDs that are single site assays, and those are LDTs that have voluntarily gone through the FDA. Distributed kits are kind of the traditional in vitro diagnostic devices that are distributed to multiple laboratories to perform. And then some kind of subsets that many people come to us and ask about are companion diagnostics, which has a very specific definition at the Food and Drug Administration. And those can be distributed kits, but often they're also single site assays, but it's a device that's necessary for the safe and effective use of a corresponding drug or biological, a therapeutic product. And that decision is made by the drug side of FDA, by CDER. And so LDTs that are making claims and offering a device, a diagnostic test that does select for a specific drug that CDER has already identified needs a companion diagnostic, needs to go through FDA. They're at a high risk for enforcement by FDA if they're not doing that. And then finally, DTC access. And certainly through the pandemic and COVID, I think the world has gained a lot more familiarity with at-home testing and direct-to-consumer access tests. But in the discussion today, we're really focused on laboratory tests that typically have at-home collection, at-home specimen collection devices. So, or you're going, you're buying that diagnostic directly and not through a healthcare provider. And some examples we added just at the bottom so that you could kind of match those up with the type of device that they are, type of diagnostic. And next slide, please. So going back to questions we receive all the time from pharma and diagnostic companies, there are really two options for drug response and therapy management indications in the United States. One, as I mentioned, is the companion diagnostic. And I think you'll get these slides afterwards. We kind of highlighted some of the details around that. This particular one, next-gen sequencing oncology panel. FDA has a product code. You see the device classification is class 3. Most companion diagnostics have been classified as class 3, but it's possible to have class 2. One example was discontinuation of a therapeutic. And these are professional use only. And Myriad's BRCA analysis is an example of that. On the other side, we have a pharmacogenetic test. FDA has been very clear that diagnostic tests in laboratories offered for pharmacogenetic claims for uses need to go through FDA. And one example of that direct-to-consumer access pharmacogenetic assessment system is 23andMe's PGS tests that report claims related to pharmacogenetics. So next, a couple of broader regulatory considerations when working in the United States, just things kind of coming down the pike in the horizon that you might be hearing about in the trade press in particular. There's a new opportunity to manage assay modifications, and it's called a predetermined change control plan, or PCCP. It's new. It was just, FDA was just given this express authority in the Omnibus Act that was passed at the end of last year in December. And what it does is enables laboratories and IVD manufacturers that are going through FDA and making a submission to also present one of these change control plans. And in that, you can come to an agreement with the agency so that changes that would have otherwise required you to do another filing, whether it's a PMA supplement or another 510K submission, you'll be able to do under your quality management system, really under your SOPs that are part of this plan. So it's really a useful tool for adding variants, making changes to your software, updating calling algorithms, and things like that. There's also fairly recent FDA guidance that gives more flexibility for changes to reagents and instruments in the same family, and software updates. It's been really helpful as some of their policies continue to evolve to move away from some of the more onerous limitations on laboratories, such as instrument or serial number limitations and restrictions on instrumentation. The big news that I think everybody talks about and everybody asks about, although it hasn't really been new news because it's been going on for the last decade and a half, is the potential for regulatory changes to permit FDA to take a more aggressive oversight role regarding laboratory developed tests. And FDA has long held the position that LDTs are a subset of IVD devices and that they already have the authority. You know, as the years have gone by in this debate, a lot of laboratories, many laboratories have voluntarily submitted, and so they've become single site IVDs under FDA regulations. But there was a lot of excitement, I think, on many fronts for the potential for legislation to be enacted by the federal government here in Congress that would kind of establish a specific type of device for diagnostics within FDA's authorities. That has stalled. There's other legislation that I hear about, multi-cancer early detection and potentially CLIA expansion in lieu of FDA oversight of clinical laboratory tests. All of those are unlikely to pass, and particularly right now as we go into an election cycle, a presidential election cycle. So I guess my caution would be, don't get your hopes up on that. FDA recognized that, I think, in the most forward way that we've heard to date, announced in the spring that they were going to move forward with regulations to clarify their oversight role for LDTs within their current regulatory authorities. So they did submit new modified regulations, the medical device regulations, and those are currently under review at the White House in an organization called OIRA, or within the Office of Management and Budget. Meetings are ongoing, but FDA is very hopeful that and has announced that they hope that those will come out by the end of September. They'll be proposed, so there'll be a comment period, and proponents and opponents will be able to formally submit comments that FDA, as part of the process of notice and comment rulemaking, will be required to respond to as they move forward to finalize those regulations. So the timing is still unclear. Sometimes it can take a month and sometimes it can take years. So it sort of remains to be seen when those actually come out of OMB and are published. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, ISO 13485, there's been a long effort to develop, add to the consensus, recognized consensus standards that FDA will recognize. ISO 13485 is now one of those. The quality system regulations under FDA have always been fairly aligned with ISO 13485, but now if you have that designation and that certification, it will be accepted in place of following the specific QSR once the regulations come out, which should be anytime fairly soon. Those have completed their review at OMB. So next slide. I know I'm going to have to speed this up a little bit. So after our intro, just a couple of kind of key considerations when you're thinking about launching a test in the United States, and we've really tried to narrow it down. What's our top 3 with respect to regulatory strategy? If you're launching as an LDT, your goal is to mitigate FDA enforcement risk. And I always say stay within the school of fish, because right now under enforcement discretion, it's something that jumps out as particularly risky or companion diagnostic claim or things like that, that FDA is going to send you a letter saying, we think you're a medical device and you need to come into compliance. For regulatory, the focus really is on understanding that FDA and CLIA coexist. So CLIA certification absolutely necessary, IRB, but you need to be thoughtful about what FDA is doing and where they're going to start imposing more regulatory authority. And a submission, as mentioned, takes a risk assessment for CTAs, significant risk or non-significant risk, to determine those submission requirements. If you're entering the market as an IVD, a distributed kit, the most important thing from the outset is really to clarify your intended use and indications for use, because that's going to determine your regulatory pathway in the United States. Another thing to consider is also a fairly new regulatory tool available, which is a breakthrough device designation, and evaluating the data that you have and how your test might change clinical care, the standard of care, may give you the opportunity to go through and take advantage of some more accelerated timelines with FDA as a breakthrough device. For compliance, you have to really be prepared for a much more comprehensive submission. Organized submission with focus on data is really what's going to win the day with FDA in their reviews. Always risk-based, and as I said, really consider the opportunity to use that predetermined case control plan, PCCP. Lastly, on the submission, you really want to confirm, and that's usually done through a pre-submission meeting with the agency, that the way you're developing your data is going to be what FDA is actually going to accept in your submission. When you don't do that, a lot of times you have to go back and redo data development, which can be excessively, can be very time consuming and burdensome from a cost perspective as well. Next slide. And with this, I think this is my cue to turn it over to Sylvia and take it from here. And I look forward to questions afterwards.
Thank you, Sheila. So the idea here is to provide you some fundamental information with regards with the constraints of placing on the market an IVD device and their use during clinical trials in Europe. And as such, we will cover the IVD regulation and timelines, the definition of LDTs in Europe, and finally, we will cover some aspects related to the management of tests during clinical trials in Europe. So overall in Europe, tests used for the purpose of diagnosis must comply to the applicable regulation, which is since May 26, 2022, the in vitro diagnostic regulation, also called IVDR. One of the first steps on knowing if the IVDR is applicable to a test is to assess whether the device will qualify as an IVD. A test will qualify as an IVD based on its intended purpose, or as Sheila explained, intended use, and will only qualify as an IVD if it fulfills the following conditions. It means the examination is conducted on human samples, the examination is conducted in vitro, and the result of the test provides an information which will be further used to take a specific medical decision. Of note, and to give you some examples, a PET scan used on the whole body to diagnose lung cancer will qualify as medical device, but not as an IVD. A test executed on a lung biopsy to diagnose lung cancer will, in that case, qualify as an in vitro diagnostic medical device, as the test is done on human specimens and in vitro. One last example, a blood group test, which is used for the purpose of transfusion, will qualify as an IVD, where the same blood test, which will be used to assess blood grouping in order to identify the best diet that could be, or the food diet which will be more appropriate, will not be considered as an IVD, as it does not support any medical decision. So basically the conclusion here is the intended purpose of the device will trigger the qualification of the device and the pathway to CE marking. Next slide, please. Companion diagnostics are a type of in vitro diagnostic devices. Of note, the definition of in vitro diagnostic, according to the former in vitro diagnostic directive, was not covering the definition of companion diagnostics. So it means that under the former European in vitro diagnostic directive, CDX didn't have any specific requirements. Now, CDX are classified based on their intended purpose. It means that an in vitro diagnostic device, in order to be classified as a companion diagnostic, must be considered, as in the United States, essential for the safe and effectiveness of corresponding medicinal product. A good flow chart allowing the determination of the classification of an IVD as a companion diagnostic is given by the MDCG guidance 2016 revision 2. Very important, since in revision 1 we didn't have this flow chart. And to give you some examples of what the companion diagnostic may be, we have devices intended to identify a marker which is specifically targeted by a corresponding drug, or to have device intended to detect an antibody against a specific medicinal product, such as during monoclonal therapies. Next slide, please. IVD devices which are used in Europe must be CE marked. So CE marking means compliance with the requirements of the applicable regulation. In the case of in vitro diagnostic devices, we are talking about in vitro diagnostic regulation, which is, as I said before, applicable in Europe since May 26, 2022. The process by which we demonstrate compliance to the requirements of the regulation and allowing CE marking of a device is called conformity assessment. Next slide, please. In contrast to United States, where we have basically FDA, which acts as a competent authority and also in charge of assessing the compliance to the US regulation, in Europe, the competent authorities of member states have designated an organism which is called notified body to assess the compliance of a device with the regulation. The designation is under a specific regulation, and in case of in vitro diagnostic devices, this is under the in vitro diagnostic regulation. Of note, for the moment in Europe, we only have 10 notified bodies who have been designated under the in vitro diagnostic regulation. It means for in vitro diagnostic devices, new products, but also legacy products, this remains a bottleneck. The notified bodies such as BSI, TÜV, DEKRA, GMED will conduct the conformity assessment process, which includes the auditing of the quality management system and also the assessment of the technical documentation related to the device, and may also audit some critical suppliers or subcontractors. The legal manufacturer is holding the responsibility of CE marking during the whole life cycle of the product. So in this setting, the competent authority is in charge, in one hand, to designate the notified body, and in the other hand, it also plays an important role in the vigilance program by managing the declaration of incidents, and also, in addition to that, it also plays a role for the registration of CE marking of low-risk products, which are Class A products, which do not require the involvement of a notified body for CE marking. Finally, in this slide, you can also see the clients which are using in vitro diagnostic devices. Under the new regulation, they are playing an important role as they are heavily involved in the vigilance activity. They need to declare the incident encounter when using the device to the competent authorities, and also to provide the feedback to the manufacturer itself. Next slide, please. The conformity assessment process, meaning the CE marking, is quite proportional to the risk profile of the device, which is triggered by the intended purpose of the device. Class A devices, which are low-risk devices, will not require the involvement of a notified body, meaning that the CE marking is done by self-declaration by the manufacturer to the competent authority. We may find here instruments such as the PCR machine, an ELISA reader, or general reagents, which are all used for an in vitro diagnostic purpose. Class B to D devices all require the involvement of the notified body that will assess during the conformity assessment procedure the compliance of the quality management system to the requirements of the ISO 30485, which is the standard for the quality management system for medical devices, but also some additional requirements which have been brought by the in vitro diagnostic regulation. In parallel, they will also assess the compliance of the technical documentation with the requirements of the regulation. Companion diagnostics that are at minimum Class C devices will require, in addition to the involvement of a notified body, the involvement of the European Medicinal Agency. And finally, Class D device, such as COVID tests, HIV, hepatitis, or blood typing for transfusion purpose, will all require, additionally to the involvement of the notified body, the involvement of a European expert panel when common specifications have not been published, or when a European reference lab do not exist. And additionally to that, they will also require a batch validation for every batch which will be manufactured. So to give you some insights in the current timing for conformity assessment, I told you that we already have this bottleneck, which is the availability of notified body, as we only have 10 notified body designated under the IVDR. But it also depends largely on the risk class of the device. And very importantly, and this is mostly the feedback that we have from the notified body, it really depends on the quality and the completeness of the technical documentation provided for review. And here, notified body are giving us as feedback, and we also see it when we are reviewing technical documentation. Most of the gaps are related to the link between the clinical evidence, basically the risk assessment, and also the verification and validation data. Some conservative estimates of the current timing for conformity assessment is to say that for Class B and C devices, except companion diagnostic, the time of the conformity assessment is somewhere between 9 to 12 months. For Class D devices, it's more between 12 and 18 months. And finally, for companion diagnostics, there are only a few of them which have been already CE marked. And for the moment, the timing is about up to 24 months. Next slide, please. As stated in one of my previous slides, the new regulation is applicable in Europe since May 26, 2022. From that date on, any new in vitro diagnostic device that is brought to the market need to comply with the new regulation. The same is also applicable for devices already on the market under the In Vitro Diagnostic Directive, meaning before May 26, 2022, which are called legacy devices, and with devices which are classified as low-risk device under the new regulation, meaning Class A devices. For all the other legacy devices, classified under the new regulation as Class B to D, there are new transition timelines which are applying to them in order, in fact, to avoid shortage of those devices on the European market. As such, Class D devices will need to comply with the in vitro diagnostic regulation by latest May 26, 2025. We see that we are very close to it. Class C devices, including companion diagnostics, will need to comply with the new regulation by May 26, 2026. And finally, Class B devices and Class A sterile devices, their timelines are a bit longer. They need to comply to the regulation by May 26, 2027. So those new timelines for legacy devices, meaning devices which were on the market before the new regulation, those timelines will apply only if there are no significant changes in the design and intended purpose introduced to the device during this transition period. And also it requires at the level of the quality management system, at the legal manufacturer, to implement the procedures which are related to the vigilance and management of economic operators. Next slide, please. Some of the devices covered by the new regulation and which have not been covered by the former in vitro diagnostic directive are the in-house devices, which are called in the United States LDTs. So the Article 5.5 of the in vitro diagnostic regulation is a restriction of application of the regulation, and it's only applicable for devices that fulfill the following condition. First of all, the devices need to be manufactured and used in a health institution established in Europe. This is very important. The device, it cannot be transferred to another legal entity. The lab which is manufacturing and using the device under an appropriate quality management system. So it means that the lab who is developing this in-house test need to comply to have a quality management system which is compliant with the ISO 15189, which is the quality standard for the quality management system for medical labs. And in addition to that, needs to implement some new procedures which are brought by the requirements of the regulation with regards to the management of the manufacturing, design, assessment of risk during design and manufacturing, and also a procedure on how they assure compliance to the regulation. And finally, the health institution provide all the information upon demand to the competent authority. Finally, and because the Article 5.5 was initially intended to cover the development of new tests in case of pandemic situation, as we have seen in the last year, or also for new or rare disease, there's a last requirement, that is that the institution must be able to justify the use of the device by the absence of any CE-marked device on the market which has the same intended purpose or who could reach an appropriate level of performance to cover the needs of a target population. So basically, this Article 5.5 can only be applicable if no CE-mark device exists on the market. So the timelines for the applicability of this article are the following. By May 26, 2022, in-house devices can be used by European labs only and cannot be transferred to another legal entity, and need to be notified to the competent authority in the member states where they are, where the lab has its place of business. All the other conditions are applicable starting from May 26, 2024. And very importantly to note, the justification of absence on the market of CE-marked devices that can cover the needs of a target population is applicable only starting from May 26, 2028. Next slide, please. So since the application of the new regulation that makes the CE marking process more stringent and additionally defines companion diagnostic and requirements of in-house devices, we have seen a massive increase in the requests related to the regulatory status of tests during clinical trials. So what is the regulatory status of assay used during clinical trials? So their regulatory status is again triggered by the intended purpose of the device during the clinical trial. If the tests do not have an impact on the medical management of a patient, the tests do not require compliance with the IVDR regulation. However, if the test impacts the medical management decisions, such as the inclusion-exclusion criteria, treatment allocation, monitoring the safety and efficiency of a treatment, or the follow-up of the patient, in this case, the test is considered as interventional, and the test will fall under the definition of an IVD and will need compliance to IVDR. So what are the possibilities to comply to the IVDR during a clinical trial, it means that either the devices which are used are CE marked, or they are in-house devices, or finally, the device itself in a process of evaluation through a performance evaluation study, which is conducted in parallel to the clinical trial. Finally, what about samples? This is another question which come quite often. What about samples which are collected during clinical trials which takes place in Europe and are shipped for testing in US? Is this possible? Well, here there is no generic answer to this question. It's clearly a case-by-case answer, but I will try to give you some hints on the aspects that we need to consider. Basically, GDPR, IVDR compliance, and applicable national laws. First of all, in Europe, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and there are a few questions to consider when conducting a clinical trial with respect to the GDPR. First of all, we have to ask the question if the information of bringing those European samples from European patients to United States, so information concerning shipping and testing of those European samples in US, it's clearly provided in the clinical trial application. Secondly, we also have to understand if the information concerning the shipment and again the testing of European sample in Europe is given also to the patient throughout the informed consent. And finally, we have to pay attention to the fact that during this transfer of samples and data of European patients, we need to make sure that there's appropriate safeguards related to the data subject right in place. For the moment, there's no legal framework, approved framework between Europe and United States. So it means that the GDPR compliance might be need to be assessed case by case. Secondly, concerning the IVDR compliance, we need to ask the question, does the device need to comply with the IVDR? In this case, we need to understand what is the currently regulatory status of the device in the United States. Is it CE marked? Of note, the applicability of the Article 6 of the IVDR with relation to the distance sales that states that a device that is not placed on the market but used in the context of a commercial activity, either for payment or for free of charge, need to comply with this regulation, meaning the in vitro diagnostic regulation. And lastly, because Europe, it's a group of 27 countries, we also have additional national laws which may apply also during clinical trials. So I'm thinking of guidances which explain how the countries would like to interpret the GDPR. We have seen in France, for instance, CNIL, who provide guidance on understanding of the GDPR requirements. And also there are some discrepancy at the level of conducting or requirements for the clinical performance studies and also for genetic testing. So another here to provide you some more inputs on clinical studies in Europe with relationship to the performance evaluation studies. To note that all the clinical performance evaluation studies for device in Europe need to be compliant with the ISO 29916 standard. So clinical studies, performance evaluation studies, which are not considered as interventional, will need to apply the Article 57 of the IVDR, where the approval of ethical committees or its waiver will be needed. This include, as I said, non-interventional studies or studies requiring leftovers or where there are no risks for patients. In the case of interventional studies, and companion diagnostics are considered as being interventional studies, additionally to the requirements of the Article 57, we also have the applicable requirements of the Article 58, which will require the approval of the competent authority and ethics committee. Even companion diagnostic studies, which are conducted using leftover samples will need notification to the competent authority and approval from an ethical committee. Next slide, please. So to give you some inputs on what exactly we need as information in order to conduct clinical performance studies in Europe, clearly for the Article 57, so this is applicable to any device which is under performance evaluation, they need to comply with the general safety and performance requirements, which are stated in the Annex 1 of the regulation, except, of course, the ones for clinical performance studies, as this is the aim of the clinical performance study, which is the aim of the study. Also, I've underlined here, of course, the need to have applicable data protection, which is the GDPR. Additionally to the requirements of the Article 57 of the IVDR, which, as I said, it's applicable to any clinical performance studies which it's related to in vitro diagnostic devices. We have, for, as I said, interventional studies, additional requirements, which are, of course, in the clinical trial protocol file, we need to have a benefit justification for foreseeable risk. So we need to have the risk management file and also assessment of the risk during the clinical trial. And what is very important is also to mention that the data related to the analytical performance of a device must be available before starting or conducting a clinical trial. So I often have this question from companion diagnostic companies which are asking me, can we start a clinical trial without having a full assessment of the analytical performance? I would say, particularly if we are talking about an interventional study, meaning that the results of the study, the test will be used on patient management, this is not possible. Additionally, for companion diagnostic, the Article 58 clearly states that when the scientific validity is not established, the manufacturer needs to provide a scientific rationale for the use of the biomarker. Thank you. I think it's my last slide.
It is. Thank you, Sylvia. And I think, Chris, I'll turn it back to you for a Q&A.
Yeah, that sounds good. And we have a few questions here. First is for Sylvia. Under IVDR, how will in-house devices be regulated? And the second part of this question is, when do you anticipate the impact of IVDR to European Union pathologists and academic centers?
Well, so as I said, IVDR, it's already applicable since May 26, 2022. So it's been a year, more than a year now that it's applicable. Now in-house devices are managed through the in vitro diagnostic regulation, but through the Article 5.5 of the regulation. So this article, it's already applicable to the devices, and manufacturer labs, medical labs, clinical labs need already to notify to their competent authority that the in-house devices that they are using. However, we still have some timelines for the application of some parts of those requirements, such as the justification that no other CE-mark device exists on the market that can be used, which will be applicable only by May 2028. Now, how this will affect and by when it will affect pathologists and laboratories in Europe, I can tell you that this already affects them. For pathologists labs and clinical labs which are using in-house devices, we have a large amount of laboratories which are currently trying to understand what are the devices that they are using in Europe. We have to understand that under the directive, none of those in-house devices were regulated by anyone except under the quality management system and the accreditation of the medical lab. So now, because it's those new requirements which are brought to those devices by in vitro diagnostic regulation, all those labs are already starting and to make the list of what are the devices which they are using in their current practice current testing, and to identify which of those devices are not CE marked, or which are those devices that are CE marked, but they are used in the lab for an intended purpose, which is outside the scope of the intended purpose given by the manufacturer. So already there, it brings an increasing amount of work for those medical labs. And then, of course, there are all those requirements related to the validation of those devices, which are in-house, which will need the proper validation. I don't know if it answered to the question of the participant.
I think so. Thank you, Sylvia. And I want to get to a few of these, a few of the other ones. A few relate to what is the advantage of an IVD over LDT as it relates to FDA's processes. So I wonder if Sheila and Joe might have an answer to that.
Sure. So in IVD, I mean, in terms of FDA, it really the decision is at this point, what level of regulatory burden do you want for your assay? So right now, it's pretty common for test developers to consider launching their test as an LDT because it's a significantly less burdensome approach from a regulatory standard. So but if you want to distribute it, if you want to offer it for some of these other claims like companion diagnostics, or you want to get ahead of the rush, if you are one of those that believe FDA is going to go ahead and publish those requirements, that's the advantage of going in and meeting with FDA early and really understanding what you're going to need to do to comply with those regulations.
And then the final question we have here is regarding the FDA pilot program that was mentioned. It says, what types of devices do you anticipate might participate, and are there any benefits that you can elaborate on from your perspective?
Sure. Well, it's fairly recently announced, and it's limited to the oncology program. It's open to any device, any diagnostic with any kind of platform. But I think the key thing to think about is that they're looking to establish minimum performance standards, and then hopefully the benefit would be more laboratories, more manufacturers can offer these companion diagnostics, and you won't be at risk for FDA enforcement by making those claims to the specific corresponding therapeutics. The challenge, I think, is and has been, do you have to have a well-characterized reference method and reference materials, and that means do you have access to those samples and to the right cell lines? So I think it's a great move by FDA to try to address this challenge we have with one drug, one test with companion diagnostics. But I think that some of the challenges that currently that diagnostics currently face in moving into an FDA regulated space are going to be there. So I suspect it's really kind of pharma driven, this oncology pilot. I suspect it's going to be those that laboratories or diagnostic manufacturers that are already partnering with pharma, or that are in a position to really attract a pharma partner by saying, we can meet these other types of FDA requirements that are going to be listed in those minimum performance standards and quality systems. I don't know if that was very long-winded. If anyone else has something else they want to add to the new pilot program, I think there's still a lot of confusion in the industry about what really to do with that.
Great, thank you, Sheila. I'm looking, there's a few more coming in here. One question might be for Sylvia concerning the performance study. When is it necessary to submit? Is it at the same time as a clinical trial or before the study starts?
Well, usually it's done in parallel because they are not the same competent authorities and ethical committees, or very often, and the files for it, they are a bit different. So normally we are talking about filing them in parallel. Very important here also to mention that there's a lot of difficulties there, and probably all those studies which are done in parallel between a sponsor, which will be an IVD manufacturer, and the pharma, I think that's very important to be discussed, and the role and responsibility of those studies be discussed very ahead of starting the clinical performance study and the clinical trial. But to come back to your question, I would say in parallel.
And then I think we are running out of time here, so I'm putting up this slide so everyone can see the contact information for the participants in case they want to. I'm not going to be able to get to all these questions, but there may be one more that we might be able to address. Are there any regulations pertaining to specimen handling other than ensuring chain of custody? And I think that that's for Sylvia.
Oh, so I can see other like biohazard and also GDPR, again, coming back to the data protection.
And I would just say, if it's FDA, and you're going through FDA with your diagnostic specimen collection device, and extraction methodologies, that's all part of the test system. Whether you're a laboratory going in as a single site assay or a manufacturer, that's going to be included in your submission.
Okay, so I think we're about at time, and I want to conclude by thanking our presenters and our co-hosts at EATRIS and Codex for SMEs. Thank you everybody for participating, and we will leave this slide up for a moment. And if anybody wants to get their questions answered, I know we didn't have time for all of them, feel free to email the people that are on your screen. So thank you everyone for participating, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and team.
Thanks a lot.